Dream of the Red Chamber is actually an unfinished work. That might sound strange, especially considering how famous it is, but it's true, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding the ending that we have. And believe it or not, that controversy is one of the reasons why this book is so beloved. And you know, the real fascinating thing about this is that Dream of the Red Chamber is not actually the only unfinished classic in Chinese literature. In fact, if you look at the history of great Chinese vernacular fiction, or even not so great fiction, you'll realize that the unfinished nature of that book is kind of par for the course. One of the most famous aspects of Dream of the Red Chamber is the fact that we have a bunch of handwritten manuscripts. These circulated around as the book was being written, and fortunately some copies still exist to this day. Now, we're not necessarily uncomfortable with the idea of early versions of a text bearing the markings of editors. After all, any good writer will use an editor. But the idea that early texts would circulate widely in handwritten form is kind of unusual to modern literary sensibilities. But the truth is that early manuscript copies in varying forms of the novel were common in certain famous novels well known in 18th century China. Or, to put this more simply, when you look at it, it almost seems like the author of Dream of the Red Chamber meant for it to be this way. Take the Shuihu Zhuan, or Water Margin, for example. With 3 different versions of differing lengths, the book is a nightmare if you're trying to keep score, and translators have to choose between a 70-chapter version, a 100-chapter version, and a 120-chapter version, and some of the longer versions include material that is duplicative or filler. More famous was probably Jinping Mei, or The Plum in the Golden Vase, which was frequently banned for its sensual content. Like Dream of the Red Chamber, The Plum in the Golden Vase contained a lot of description in the early chapters that offered clues about the fate of certain characters by the end of the book. And like Dream of the Red Chamber, the chapters near the end of Jinping Mei are vastly different from those at the beginning of the book, something that we would consider inconsistent today. But it seems that this inconsistency was actually a literary technique that was quite popular during the Ming and Qing dynasties. And the part that is even more fascinating is this idea of the book itself being an open text, something that should be familiar to you in the message board age. When you look at the handwritten copies of Dream of the Red Chamber, you're not looking at a master storyteller's finished text. You're looking at literature in process, and it's clearly a process that multiple people can participate in at the same time. And as the Cambridge History of Chinese Literature so articulately describes, this creates a sort of open-ended literary discursive space, almost like leaving comments on an online message board. Well, maybe this will help you understand why I've chosen to create my translation of this book as a blog instead of publishing it the more traditional way. You know, the back and forth discussion that we can have in a living and frequently updated blog is a lot more interesting than me sitting in a dark room somewhere and translating something and hoping that the reader understands. Plus, the truth is that this book is really complex, and I could use all the help I could get to try to figure this thing out. Now, one thing that is special about Dream of the Red Chamber is the somewhat bizarre way it was originally published. Decades after Cao Shuiqin passed away, a scholar named Gao worked together with another scholar named Cheng Weiyuan to edit what they could find of the handwritten manuscripts. Now, the handwritten manuscripts included only 80 chapters, though these men claim to have found enough notes to piece together the ending, which includes the final 40 chapters. In all seriousness, there are well-respected Chinese scholars of this book who believe that Gao and Cheng Weiyuan were part of some massive conspiracy to hide the true meaning of the novel. Alright, I'm going to be blunt with you guys, and some of you might not like this, but I really think those conspiracy theories are full of hot air. In fact, I think that they're largely predicated on a modern misunderstanding of the nature of Chinese literature during the Ming Dynasty and before. It actually was not all that odd then for books to lack a suitable ending, or for the nature and tone of the book to significantly change as the book went on. Well, take Journey to the West, for example. It's a great story, sure, but it could also technically go on forever. If you've ever watched the old Dragon Ball or Dragon Ball Z series, you know what I'm talking about. Romance of the Three Kingdoms is similar. The book is really a loose collection of stories. This is not a book that was tightly composed with a clear draw-down period after a climax. Instead, the book just sort of ends. Now, the fascinating thing here that also will likely get me in some trouble is the fact that you can see this pattern in modern East Asian writing as well as in things like TV shows. I love the old slam dunk anime, but anybody who's watched it all the way through knows that the second season is almost nothing but filler. Sailor Moon is another one of my favorites, but the storyline and the characters seem to change dramatically in the later seasons, which is really off-putting. There's an old Korean drama from the mid-2000s I've always liked called Chilgongju. Even there, though, the story doesn't really come to a natural ending. The unresolved elements just sort of end during the final episode. Now, watching this kind of stuff is kind of like listening to a Beethoven symphony. You know, you think it's going to be over soon, but then it lingers on and on and on. The difference, though, is that the ending that you get with Beethoven at the very end sounds like it's the ending. But the ending that you get with some of these works, some of these TV shows and stuff, just doesn't have that feel of finality to it. Now, when it comes to Dream of the Red Chamber, there actually is a little bit of textual evidence there that this is just how Cao Shui-Qin wanted this book to be. This poem in the middle of the first chapter of Dream of the Red Chamber is the most commonly quoted poem in the novel. My translation is, when falsehood is taken as truth, the truth becomes false. Where nothing is claimed to be something, the something becomes nothing. But of course, the meaning is really ambiguous. It's a poem that takes full advantage of the ambiguous nature of Chinese grammar. That means that the translations of this poem vary widely. But the part that they don't tell you in the normal translations is how this poem relates to discussions of literature during the Ming Dynasty, or even more interesting than that, to the world of Southern Chinese theater in the Ming Dynasty. You see, the truth is that just about everything in Dream of the Red Chamber is part of a bigger literary meta discussion, and it is impossible to reflect that in a traditional translation of the book. To understand this, you have to realize that literary people in the late Ming Dynasty cared a lot about the genuineness of feeling in the dramas that they watched. In particular, there was this idea that the courtesans who participated in theater were actually living the life that they were portraying on stage. And this helped give way to this idea that everything in life ought to be done for the sake of love or for the sake of raw emotion and not out of some Confucian duty. That focus on raw emotion helped give way to this idea that women ought to sacrifice themselves out of loyalty, including loyalty to their lovers, and not just because it was their Confucian duty. You can think of this as the cult of romantic love, which was quite interesting in a culture in which marriage was usually an arrangement made by the families of two strangers. In other words, all of this talk in that poem about what is real and what is false is actually a reflection on the contradictory aspects of Chinese society at the time. For example, you wind up being forced to be married to somebody who you've never met and who you have no feelings for at all. And the only way you can live out those real feelings, the life you really want to live, is through illicit relationships. That's what the poem is about. In that sense, it's actually fitting that Dream of the Red Chamber has an ending that seems like a false ending. There are predictions in the early poems in the book that are not fulfilled in the end, which has led many scholars to cry foul. However, I honestly think that Gaoe and Cheng Weiyuan have received a lot of undue criticism over the years. After all, Jia Baoyu and Lin Dayu were simply never going to be together, no matter what you think of them. And, well, sometimes in real life, things don't work out the way that we imagine that they will, or the way that we think the cosmos planned that they will. Then again, you don't have to take the ending of Dream of the Red Chamber at face value. You see, there's a lot of other magic here as well. The magic of this book is the same as the magic of Southern Chinese theater at that time. It's also the magic of stories today. The characters come back to life when you start the book over again. And since it was written as an open book from the start, and really since all literature is open canon and open literature, especially if you know about fan fiction, the only limit to what the characters can do and how they can live is your own imagination.